The film begins by introducing a brigadier general named Hummel, who has recently lost his wife and is seen returning to her grave that morning to reveal his plan for revenge. Hummel has been preparing this plan for a long time, but waited for his wife to pass away before executing it. A few nights later, a group of Marines infiltrated a military base, specifically the main base where the American military stores various deadly weapons. This group was led by Hummel, and that night they broke in to steal a secret weapon. After subduing the guards, they managed to gain access to the weapons storage. Inside the vault, there were many missiles, but what they were after were the missiles stored in the Level 4 room. One by one, these missiles were taken out. Unfortunately, during the operation, someone accidentally dropped a missile, revealing that its contents were the most lethal chemical weapon. On the other side, an FBI agent and biochemist named Dr. Stanley Goodspeed is seen examining a package believed to have been sent by an unknown terrorist group. Therefore, the package is immediately taken to the laboratory for inspection. Initially, when they opened it, everything seemed normal, but suddenly the package sprayed out toxic gas. Not only did it spray toxic gas inside the doll, there was also a C4 bomb, and Stanley had less than a minute to neutralize it. The problem was, the toxic gas from the doll also started melting their clothes, and if it touched their skin, Stanley would be doomed. Fortunately, Stanley managed to control the situation. He even appeared very calm while defusing the bomb. However, his reaction was the complete opposite when his girlfriend, Jade, visited his apartment and announced that she was pregnant. Back to Hummel, who was disguising as a tourist. That morning, they visited an island that was once America's most secure prison, The Rock. During the visit, Hummel with his team executed a sabotage, and they immediately took all the tourists on the island hostage. Not stopping there, they also planned to turn the island into their main base. At that moment, Hummel finally revealed his main plan and the reason for betraying his country. Apparently, after years of service, he saw many of his men die in illegal secret missions. Unfortunately, these fighters were not recognized by the country, and their families were not given any compensation. Because of this, Hummel and his team demanded justice for these incidents. That night, Hummel contacted an FBI leader named Womack and stated that they were holding 81 civilians. Not stopping there, he also announced that they were ready to launch 15 chemical missiles into San Francisco if their demands were not met. For now, Womack was asked to gather the country's top officials. In short, that night, all the top officials gathered for a special meeting. They were shocked to hear that Brigadier General Hummel had betrayed them because, aside from being a military leader, Hummel was also known as a national hero. During his service, Hummel had successfully completed dozens of important missions. At that moment, Hummel conveyed his demands and asking the government to send $100 million to a designated account. There were 83 members of Hummel who had fallen in missions, and to this day their families had not received compensation. Hummel then planned to distribute all the money to the families of the fallen fighters. On the other hand, unlike a terrorist attack, this time the government is being threatened by their own soldiers. Therefore, they must be very cautious. If the government refuses to comply with the demands, the lives of the hostages and all the residents of San Francisco will be at stake. Additionally, the missile that Hummel plans to launch is actually classified as a secret weapon. So, the chief of staff immediately asked just how dangerous the missile could be. It turns out that a single X-5 missile could kill no fewer than 70,000 civilians, and the only way to stop the missile attack is to sabotage the chip inside it. However, the missile can only be opened by a biochemistry expert, which is where Dr. Stanley's expertise is needed. The government also plans to send a special forces team to the Rock Island, but the island has long been uninhabited, and the prison on the island has been renovated several times. Therefore, they need someone skilled enough to infiltrate it. The head of the FBI actually knows the only prisoner who ever escaped from the Rock prison, John Patrick Mason. However, this inmate is very secretive and also extremely dangerous. Now, they must find a way to persuade Mason to help and reveal how he managed to escape from the Rock Island. Knowing this, an agent named Paxton is then ordered to conduct the interrogation. With the promise of a release letter from the Attorney General, Mason is asked to cooperate in the mission. Unfortunately, due to Paxton's overly harsh attitude, he fails to persuade Mason, and as a replacement, Stanley is suddenly asked to enter the interrogation room. Even though, throughout his career at the FBI, Stanley has never dealt directly with a criminal. Therefore, When he enters, Stanley immediately agrees to all of Mason's demands. It turns out that everything they offered to Mason was unreasonable. Even if he agreed to cooperate, the head of the FBI had no intention of releasing him. While they were talking, Mason secretly took the coin that Paxton had tossed towards him. He then flattened the coin using the edge of a chair, and when the opportunity arose, Mason once again attempted to escape from the location, but his escape attempt was quickly thwarted. Under tight security, he was finally taken to the Fairmont Hotel where the FBI rented an entire floor to secure him. Mason was allowed to bathe, clean up, and so on. However, Mason wouldn't be Mason if he simply accepted his situation. Once again, he quietly began looking for a way to escape. Shortly after, a hairstylist was brought in to cut the long hair of the most dangerous prisoner, but while being shaved, Mason secretly tied a string that he had taken from the bathroom. Mason also ordered room service in the form of a buffet, which eventually kept all the officers busy snacking. When the opportunity presented itself, Stanley suddenly tried to hold Mason at gunpoint. But at this point, they were not in a position to negotiate. One wrong move, and the FBI chief would fall from a great height. In the end, Mason managed to escape from dozens of guards. Once Director Womack was rescued by his team, Stanley immediately rushed to chase Mason. Unfortunately, during the chase, Stanley was ambushed, and Mason managed to flee the scene by stealing a car parked in the hotel lobby. After that, several police cars were then deployed to capture Mason, while Stanley himself commandeered a Ferrari that happened to be in the hotel lobby. A high-speed chase ensued, causing chaos throughout the city of San Francisco. To evade the police, Mason deliberately knocked down a utility pole by crashing into it. This led to a series of accidents, and Stanley was the only agent left in the chase. In short, Mason caused more trouble by accidentally crashing into a tram. As a result, the large vehicle derailed, leading to an unexpected disaster. Fortunately, Stanley survived the crash and continued his pursuit by forcibly taking a motorcycle from a civilian who happened to be nearby. However, Mason had already gotten quite far. Therefore, Stanley asked other agents to find out if Mason had any family in the city. It turned out that Mason had fled to meet his daughter, whom he had never met in person. It turns out that Mason is a former member of the British Special Forces who was captured by the Americans. Mason has spent 30 years in prison, and to this day, the British government refuses to acknowledge his existence. Now, he has no hope left in life except for his daughter. Therefore, Mason tries to convince his daughter that he is not a bad person. At the same time, just as he started talking, the police surrounded the area. Secretly, Stanley had been listening to the conversation between Mason and his daughter. Therefore, Stanley also lied to Mason's daughter, telling her that her father was now working for the FBI. It was hoped that this lie could help improve Mason's relationship with his daughter. However, Mason's actions during his escape had made Womack extremely angry. At the military headquarters, Mason was asked to explain the layout of the Rock Island. But because Mason had escaped from there more than 20 years ago, he had begun to forget the details of his escape. Fortunately, Mason said he might still remember if he went directly to the location. Hearing this, Womack became furious because he knew it was just a ploy. Back to Dr. Stanley, who explained to the Special Forces team how to neutralize the chemical missiles that Hummel had stolen. Since there wasn't enough time for a detailed explanation, they finally asked Stanley to join the mission. Because Stanley has never killed a criminal, Paxton tries to reassure him that the Special Forces team they are sending is the best, so he can focus solely on neutralizing the chemical missiles. However, there is something else that worries Stanley, that his girlfriend has flown to San Francisco, which could be hit by the chemical missiles within the next few hours. Before heading to the Rock Island, the leader of the Special Forces, named Anderson, conducted a briefing in which he asked Stanley to light a green flare if he successfully neutralized all 15 chemical missiles. From there, the mission began. Shortly after, 3 helicopters approached the island, but they were just a diversion because from the start, they planned to be dropped into the sea. The plan was for Mason to lead the way onto the island through the underwater sewer system. Seeing this, Hummel had already suspected that military leaders would try to send special forces to the Rock Island. Therefore, he ordered his men to sweep every location immediately. On the other hand, once they entered the prison building, Stanley and his companions got trapped in a room, with the only way to access the door was to go through a combustion machine. Unexpectedly, after 20 years, Mason still remembered the details of his escape. Even at the age of 60, his body could still move very agilely. Finally, they managed to enter the underground water channel where Hummel and his team had set up motion sensors at several points, so they had to be very careful. At that moment, one of Anderson's team members tried to neutralize the sensor above the water channel so they could enter the building through that route. Unfortunately, the sensor was a trap from the start. Even if they managed to neutralize it, their location had already been detected. As soon as Anderson and his team surfaced, they were surrounded from all directions. At that moment, Hummel asked Anderson to surrender. Moreover, they had no other way to escape. But Anderson insisted on resisting, leading to a confrontation between the two of them. On the other hand, Stanley and Mason were still hiding in the water channel, as they didn't rush to surface. Unfortunately, Anderson and his team had no chance against Hummel, as they were all slaughtered mercilessly. Seeing this, one of Anderson's team members, who had been hiding with Stanley, insisted on helping his friends. But, in the end, that team member was also killed on the spot. After taking a radio and weapons from the bodies in front of them, Mason urged Stanley to escape immediately. Meanwhile, people at headquarters realized that the two of them were still alive based on the trackers attached to their clothing. Instead of sending a backup team, Womack ordered Stanley to continue the mission. After that, Hummel deeply regretted the recent events, and he sent a threatening message to headquarters, stating that once again the government has shown its disregard for the soldiers who have fought for the nation. The question now is why Womack is so confident that this mission can succeed with only 2 people remaining. It is explained that 30 years ago, Mason was captured because he successfully stole a microchip containing all the secret intelligence information of the United States. To this day, the microchip has not been found, which demonstrates Mason's intelligence and skill in handling any situation. At that time, Mason was only tasked with infiltrating the special forces into the Rock Island. Therefore, he had not been informed about the weapon that Hummel was planning to launch. Once Stanley leaked this information, Mason finally agreed to continue the mission, and all of this was to ensure the safety of his daughter who lives in San Francisco. At the same time, the enemy finally realized that there were still 2 intruders they needed to eliminate. Not wanting to take any risks, Hummel ordered his men to blow up the underground channels immediately. One by one, bombs were dropped, and the 2 of them barely survived the attack. As a result of the explosion, their communication with headquarters was cut off. Because the enemy believed that the 2 of them had been eliminated, Stanley and Mason found it easier to infiltrate the building. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, they went straight to the main storage area of the chemical missiles. At that moment, a gunfight ensued, but Stanley warned that they mustn't let their bullets miss and hit the missiles. After that, one of the enemies attempted to detonate a bomb. Fortunately, Mason managed to stop him. Without wasting time, Stanley tried to neutralize the missiles one by one. The problem was that extraordinary precision and calm were required to do all of this, and one mistake would be fatal. After some time, Hummel finally realized their presence, and the entire force was tasked to follow them to the location. However, Stanley did not want to leave before successfully disarming all the missiles in front of him. They both then fled into the sewer, but an unexpected event occurred when they found an old mining cart in the channel. And they were happy to ride the cart because it allowed them to escape the enemy pursuit. Knowing that all the chips in the missiles were gone made Hummel furious. He then ordered 3 of his men to follow them below, and it didn't take long for them to find Stanley. Fortunately, even in such a desperate situation, Mason did not run out of ideas. While Stanley tried to escape using a device similar to a cable car. After that, 2 enemy soldiers nearly killed him in a shootout. Fortunately, Mason came to his rescue again. In short, there were 8 hours left before the missile was to be launched. Thanks to them, the number of missiles had drastically decreased. Initially, there were 15, and now only 3 remained. Because of this, Hummel needed to capture Stanley quickly to reclaim the chips. Instead of surrendering, Mason destroyed the chips, and he didn't care if one hostage's life was lost because it was insignificant compared to the number of victims that would result if the missiles were launched. Mason also saw this as an opportunity and asked Stanley to continue his search while he would surrender to distract the enemy. Stanley eventually found one of the chemical missiles, and he quickly took the chip from it. In the midst of their operation, the enemy suddenly reappears and captures Stanley. At the same time, Mason is bombarded with questions by Hummel. During this, Mason explains that in all his years of service, he has never seen an old man assigned to a special mission, and that both of them have been betrayed by their country. However, this does not mean that innocent people should bear the burden. Eventually, Mason and Stanley are thrown into prison, where Stanley does not stop complaining about their situation, while Mason quietly takes action again. Fortunately, Hummel does not know who Mason is, as he does not place many guards to prevent his escape. Equipped with a spray and a bed frame, Mason manages to escape from the prison once again. On the other hand, the leaders at headquarters assumed that Stanley and Mason were dead because their GPS signals were no longer functioning. Therefore, they began planning a contingency plan, which included sending some fighter jets to destroy the Rock Island within the next hour. Not long after, the time that Hummel had given the government was running out. But up to this point, they had not met his demands. On the contrary, the government called to request more time. This made all of Hummel's subordinates anxious, urging him to make a decision immediately. With no other options, Hummel finally approved the launch of one missile towards San Francisco. Knowing this, the leaders at headquarters were terrified because the missile was headed for a football stadium, which would result in tens of thousands of casualties if it hit. At the last moment, Hummel secretly used his computer to change the missile's coordinates until the missile ultimately hit the sea. At that moment, several of Hummel's men realized that it is their leader's doing. Consequently, one of Hummel's subordinates, Major Tom Baxter, questions his actions. It turns out that Hummel never intended to kill any civilians from the beginning, and all of his actions were just bluffs to pressure the government into delivering justice. Back to Stanley and Mason, who managed to secretly infiltrate the main building. When the missile was launched earlier, Stanley panicked, but Mason had suspected from the start that Hummel would not dare to kill civilians. With the proof is that up until now, they had not been executed. At the same time, there was still one more rocket they needed to disable for the mission to succeed. Seeing Hummel's action earlier made the President of the United States finally agree to destroy the Rock Island. Even though there were 81 hostages held there, the government decided to proceed with their plan to avoid any further attacks. Shortly after, some of Hummel's men confronted him, questioning the recent actions. But he tried to explain that all their efforts were over, and now it was time to escape. Unfortunately, these three men were very eager for the ransom money, and they had sacrificed their military careers for this mission. As a result, a conflict arose among them. At the same time, Mason and Stanley secretly listened to the entire conversation, where they immediately moved to save Hummel to find out the location of the last chemical missile. Without wasting time, Stanley headed there. Unfortunately, as a result of this incident, Hummel lost his life, as did his loyal member, Major Tom Baxter. Not long after, Stanley finally managed to find the last missile, and in the midst of his actions, the enemy reappeared. Fortunately, the enemy did not dare to fire when they saw Stanley holding dozens of chemical balls in his hands. Amid the confusion, Stanley suddenly came up with an idea to defeat his enemies. Stanley then climbed to the top floor to neutralize the missile as quickly as possible. During his actions, one of the chemical balls fell to the ground. Fortunately, it didn't explode, but another problem arose when an enemy spotted him from afar and started shooting relentlessly. Luckily, Mason came to his aid shortly after, and Stanley managed to secure all the missiles. After that, Stanley needed to inform the people at headquarters about their successful mission by lighting the green flare because, if not, within a few minutes, the Rock Island would be reduced to rubble. At the same time, Stanley was continuously chased by one of the enemies. Mason then tried to save him again, but the obstacles seemed endless. In the end, Stanley had to face the enemy in front of him with his bare hands and some chemical ball from the missile as his ultimate weapon. It turned out, Stanley also secretly had an antidote for the poison. However, the antidote would not work if the user had been exposed for more than 5 seconds. After defeating his enemy, Stanley quickly lit the flare because the fighter jets were almost at the island. The Marines monitoring the situation from afar immediately notified the people at headquarters, and Paxton quickly told the fighter pilots to abort their mission. In the end, one of the fighter jets had already dropped its bomb. Fortunately, the bomb only hit the back of the island. Because of this, Stanley survived, although he was slightly affected by the explosion. Sometime later, the leaders at headquarters tried to contact the two of them again, where they asked if Mason was still alive, but Stanley chose to lie. As a token of his gratitude, Mason gave Stanley a small note containing information about the location where the secret microchip was stored. This microchip had been sought after by the government for the past 30 years. Not long after, the top FBI officials came to pick him up and they asked once again about Mason's whereabouts. But Stanley said his body had been turned to ashes due to the chemical gas. The film ends. Moral lesson from the story: always double-check your packages, or you might end up wrestling a toxic teddy bear and saving San Francisco by accident. And remember, plotting revenge is easier after a good haircut and a plate of snacks.